But there are many from the Northern Triangle who are fleeing desperate circumstances. And one of the questions is, why are, in this day, so many fleeing from the Northern Triangle? So our last panel is going to be led by Bekah McNeel. Bekah, if you would come up and get ready to introduce your panelists. Are you ready? You ready?
Yes, I'm getting mic'd up.
Okay. Bekah is Immigrant Communities Editor for Christianity Today. She's based in San Antonio, Texas. And she's got a terrific panel here that is going to help us enter into a dialogue about just what is happening in these countries in the Northern Triangle that is creating some of the migrant caravans that Douglas joined. And so please come up, Bekah, and lead us.
I didn't position myself very well for this. Hi, everybody. It's so fun to be here. And I think I have 4 panelists, and so I'm going to stand up here so that they can sit. So I'm like double mic'd. But that's so good to see all of you. It encourages my heart to see all of you here. And I'd like to ask my panelists to go ahead and come on up here and let's dive right in, because I want to give them as much time as possible to share their work and some perspective about the people who are coming here from Central America. So guys, if y'all want to just come up and get comfortable. So while they get seated, a lot of the time when we talk about the caravans or people coming from the Northern Triangle countries, especially El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, commonly referred to as the Triangle, we talk about the reasons that they're coming, the push factors. And when those things are thrown into media stories in American media or in our conversations, we use familiar words because we need familiar words, but they take on their American meaning or their American context here. And so I think that a lot gets lost. And so one of the great things that we're going to have with this panel is the ability to get some more context from the actual places. So when we talk about gang violence, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about hopelessness, what does that mean in that context? And so I want to introduce everybody. I'm going to go different from what their pictures are because they sat down in a different order. I want to start with Jill. Jill is with AJS, but in Honduras, it is switched. ASJ. And they're going to share with more about their work later. I'm going to, rather than listening to me do that, they will do a much better job. She is joining us. Their work is deep, deep, deep in Honduras. And so I think that there are some unique things about that country, things happening in that country and their work there. Next we have Edouard, and he is with Compassion International. And while Compassion, as we all know, works in many places, we've asked him to kind of be our resident Guatemala voice and talk about things going on there. And then we have Dr. Eva. It's her birthday. Yeah. Evelyn and David is here. They're with ENLACE, and David is going to give us some backup support for translation if we need it. But I wanted to start with just quick snapshots of what outmigration is looking like in each of these countries. Is it increasing, decreasing, families, unaccompanied minors? Just give us a snapshot. Rather than we see the caravan, kind of disaggregate the caravan for us. Tell us about each of these countries.
So thank you. Well, I have been working over the last 7 years with ENLACE, working with local equipping churches and community leaders to develop sustainable solutions to poverty. So I have been working on the field with these local churches and these community leaders, working with in their mission to transform their communities. So El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, by 6.4 million people. 40% of them live on the rural areas. So the context of the rural areas, it's very similar in most of them. So people immigrate from El Salvador represent of 1/5 of its population. So at the rural areas, the context is very similar. So I want to share, so I have the opportunity to meet Maria at El Cocalito. It's a community located of Southwest region from El Salvador. So Maria lives with her husband and 2 teenage girls, 2 teenage daughters. So her husband, she was diagnosed with cancer. Her husband works eventually on different agriculture stuffs. Their income's family is less than $3 per day when he's able to work, because they don't have access to a work every day. So Maria and her family have to move continuously every month or every year to a home, because they don't have access to a home. They didn't have access to a tenancy. So Maria is always worried about her daughters that were exposed by the violence, because the gangs control their community. So most of the young people had to flee to other countries by the violence. Every time that they have to move, it was very difficult because by the gangs. So as Maria has felt without hope, she always say that if she die, what is going to happen with their girls? What is happening if they have to flee to other country? So Pastor Israel from the local church at the Cocalito, working with its community leaders, they did something different to make a real change in the community. So they decide to go deeper to its community, to know their people, to make new friends, to know these gang members. They were on the front ground with their people. So the work with the church, with the community leaders, they understand that their community are being affected by multiple dimensions of poverty. It's not just lack of money. It's more just education, housing, health, security. So the church and the community leaders are addressing those structural issues to poverty. Mm-hmm. So a month ago, I had the privilege to be with Maria celebrating her new home, because the church working with this community and working with local government organizations like Mayor's Office, they give the opportunity to Maria and 11 more families to have a new house. So Maria was very happy. On all this process, the gangs are gone right now. The community is secure. Some of gang members start to work on some projects. They involved to the work of the community. So Maria was very happy. It was amazing to see. I have been blessed to see all the process with Maria and see the happiness in her face. You can imagine how Maria is grateful she is.
Right.
So it's very awesome to see the church working with this community to their people. Mm-hmm. So now Maria has hope, And I think this is one of the most important things. I truly believe that one of the most important things is to be friends with their community. So,
Awesome.
Well, our story is very similar. Thank you. Because we do, I mean, in Compassion, we also work with the church. The church is the presence in the local community through which we work and which we partner with. And because those people leaving their communities, they don't choose to, they don't want to many times, but many times they have to because of hopelessness. Because poverty gives you the message of hopelessness. You do not matter. Poverty tells you that there is no tomorrow for you. And therefore, working with the church and the church coming alongside of the people on the ground, that is what we see as the hope and the potential to make a difference. I remember I was in Guatemala about 2 weeks ago, and I visited a village in Alta Verapaz, which is on the north side of Guatemala. It's it's an indigenous village, of indigenous population. And we visited with this family of 8 people in a small room, about maybe 10 by 10 feet. 8 people. The mother, the father, 5 children, and 1 grandchild. Now, the oldest child of the family was 16, and she had a baby. And the father himself was the only one working when he could find work. Going away so that he can find work for $5 a day when he gets a job. Now, this is the type of family that would be actually the target for migration. They would actually say, you know what is there for me in this community? But thankfully, the church has come alongside of them to help and provide support. 2 of their children at least are part of the Compassion program. And when you look at that story and you multiply it several times, these are the type of people and the circumstances that actually drive them out. In reality, when you look at the last statistics from the World Bank, it tells you that almost 80% of the population, of indigenous population in Guatemala, live in poverty. And 40% of them in extreme poverty. And when you also put that with the fact that 63% of the Guatemalans who leave come from indigenous villages and populations. So each country has their own story, but you have to really get into it to truly understand. And here again, we believe that the church can and does make a difference when the church lives out the gospel, the full gospel, preaching spiritually, but also equipping young people and families to make a difference for themselves.
Before Jill starts, I want to draw out one thing, and this came out in our conversations before with all of you, that a lot of what you're hearing about is the failure or the weakness of institutions and the church coming in and representing institutional health. Because we always talk about this in an American context, we think of poverty, gang involvement, all of that as a very individualized issue. We think of it as there are institutions that are, while we might resent them or whatever, are for the most part functional, and individuals making choices to engage, to disengage, how they engage. And what is, I think, really critical that you guys are drawing out is how when the institutions begin to fail, when the church comes in, the church has to make a decision to spread institutional health and engage with other institutions. And so I think that really segues nicely into what AJS is doing.
Yeah, pretty well. So AJS is a Christian organization that is intentionally trying to fix those institutions in Honduras. So we work with the institutions that we believe are most affecting the most vulnerable people and the ones that I think you've heard a lot of it today. So the three core institutions that we're working on: education, health, and security. And when those institutions fail people over and over and over again, you get what happens. You lose hope. And so maybe I'll just give you a few examples of how those institutions fail and have failed in Honduras. Let me give you an example in education. In education, we've done a study that from 2000 until 2010, there's about 2 million kids that attend public schools in Honduras. Kids were averaging 125 days of class. The law requires them to have 200 days of class, but the teachers wouldn't show up, they'd go on strike, and so kids were getting 2/3 of the education that they needed. And not only that, but 26% of teachers who were being paid to be in the classroom were missing from the classroom. So the student would show up and their teacher wouldn't be there, so they'd go home. A failure of the institution. I'm happy to report they've had 7 years straight of 200 days of class now. So we're on the right trajectory, but it's an institution that had been failing and still has a lot of issues. Healthcare. 80% of Honduran society depends on the public healthcare system, which is a basic healthcare system that's provided. That means the government ends up being the largest purchaser of medicine throughout the country. We did a sample study of all the pharmaceuticals that the government was buying, and over 20% of them did not have the active ingredients required in the medicine that was being given. We found one pill that was flour. It was the consistency of flour, a blood pressure medicine that was being distributed throughout the country for people with high blood pressure. An institution, again, that's failing its people due to corruption. And finally, security. If you've heard about Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, if you've heard about violence caused, I would like to underline what Sammy said earlier, by the U.S. drug consumption. So Honduras didn't used to be the most violent country in the world. You only started hearing about it over the last 10 years. And that's because in 2004, the homicide rate was 30 per 100,000. That homicide rate tripled in 5 years. And it tripled because drug traffickers started using Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala as the primary transit point of cocaine coming from South America and going to North America. It didn't change because of anything that happened in Honduras. Besides that Honduras became a very good place for drug trafficking to do business. Why? Because of weak institutions. And so the church, we believe, as a Christian organization, has a very specific role to play in helping the institutions become strengthened, to help the healthcare institution, to help the education system, to help the security system. And to do so, we publish all the reports that I've just shared with you. But I would like to also say that we never publish a report without a proposal or a solution. One next step that can be taken by the government, because criticizing doesn't help progress. You need to move forward as well. So.
Right. So when you talk to people, and I think a big goal for this group is how do we take this message in our respective spheres of influence and help people understand. And so when you are talking to Americans who think of our institutions in a particular way, earlier, Edouard, you said maybe take them for granted a little bit. How do you help them understand what is happening on the ground? What are the best tools you have to communicate and help a U.S. audience really get a picture of the desperation or the hopelessness when we really actually have no context for it.
So AJS, we are a research-based institution. We do very in-depth research on all of our projects, and that's what spurs on action. So for us, a lot of what we do is make that research accessible not only in Honduras, but also here in the United States in an understandable way. So those reports I just shared on education took 4 years of researching. But how can you put that into sound bites that they become popularized? If you're in Honduras now, you're going to hear about a ton of people talking about 200 days of class. That's actually a 100-page report that we put out, but you had to find those sound bites to help make it understandable to the general populace to start movements. So part of that is doing the really good research, but then making it also accessible.
And for us in Compassion, we do a lot of communication with our individual sponsors and donors, and we use different mechanisms to actually communicate with them. And we do a lot through having the pastors of the churches that are partnering with us in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras actually tell their stories. And when it's personal, it takes on a more potent and powerful message. We also encourage those who can and want to go and visit to actually see it for themselves. And I know I was talking to, I think, Michael, who's been in El Salvador in one of our visiting a couple of our churches, and seeing for themselves, and then coming and telling the story as a pastor himself and as a leader to actually say, this is what is going on. In many ways, you cannot totally explain it all. You have to go bite-sized, little by little, so that to make sense of it. How do you understand the reality that the police is corrupt? Your judge, you don't trust them. Your education, the school is actually a ground for recruiting gang members. I mean, how does that compute? Unless you actually take people one step at a time through personal stories to make it alive.
So during the process, when we start to work with the church and the community, we training about to the first, before to their involved, do some projects. The community with the church make a baseline. They do some community service to know to identify the real needs, and this helps to the community to know much deeper about how deprivations have at the community. This helps to the community and to other people to know about. And we try to make impact study then to make a real change.
And so, finally, I think as our last question from me, and I don't want to put anybody on a political spot, but as individuals and as members of a democracy, what can Americans do to help your work? And what can we do, what can we do to alleviate the root causes, and what can we do to exacerbate them? When we are advocating, when we're donating, when we are investing, when we are hopefully not doing drugs, what can we do? Hopefully that's not a question we're all asking. But what are we doing as a country, as a church in the United States, on any level you feel comfortable speaking, to help and to hurt?
I'll take a stab at it. I would say, especially as a church, what can the church do to actually help, especially alleviate the burden? Because, I mean, compassion, we are interested in the preventive approach of it. And I think sometimes we can be overwhelmed by the news and by the numbers that are flooding through the borders and everything. But you look at it you take pieces of it and say, well, what can we do? And I would encourage, the church to invest in a church in those countries that are actually helping and servicing and ministering in areas of need. That is what is going to actually help those families from feeling the sense of hopelessness to a sense of, yes, I'm surrounded with love, and there is hope for me and for my family and for the future. That is where I would start. Just connecting church to church to make a difference in those localities and communities where this desperation actually comes from.
I think it's very important invest on these people, on these churches and the community to strengthen their abilities, to capacities to continue work in their communities. I think it's very important to training them, because the sustainable solution that they can be able to do in their communities, it's going to be a real change. I think the change occurs when there are strong connections between leaders. So I think it's very important to invest in these people that they want to do something different in their communities. And this is very important, that the work with the church, that I think it's the agent of transformation. They can be able to work with this community and be something different.
So I'll start on the hurt side, because I like to end in hope. So one very specific thing right now for these three countries is that U.S. aid has been cut to the Northern Triangle. So a little bit of it has been restored, but almost all of our U.S. aid has been cut. So there are many things that we can do to help, but for example, AJS was receiving about $2 million of U.S. government assistance to do violence prevention programs that had successfully decreased violence in 3 of the most violent communities in Honduras by 75%. And all of that funding has just been cut. And it will be another 12 months before that would be restored because of grant cycles. So you can talk to your congressman as something that we've done that is hurtful, but that can be corrected as well. So that would be one thing. The second is, I think as U.S. citizens and citizens of this world, we need to recognize that we are interconnected. It is not just a U.S. and a Honduras thing, but we are connected by good and by harm. And I think we just need to recognize that and say we need to be a part of the broad solutions as well, that aren't just U.S. solutions, but that are solutions for this world. And specifically for the church, I think we need to lament the fact that we've done pain around the world. And we continue to do pain and harm around the world. And we need to lament that. We need to ask for forgiveness for that. And we need to recognize it. And we joke that we don't, hopefully we aren't using drugs, but I guarantee there are people in your communities that are, and that are continuing to fuel some of the problems that we are facing in Central America. So what can we do about that? And then lastly, I do think one of our goals in Honduras is we are a Christian organization, and I think in a place where there is deep crisis and deep challenge, we have seen how the church is the powerful voice of hope. And I think that's true here, and I think that's true in Honduras, and I think that's what can unite us, is that there is a hope, not just a hope for the future and for heaven, but a hope here today and for the kingdom that we can bring here to our communities.
Right. Thank you guys so much. They're coming to.
May I add one more comment? I also want to say that even as we connect church to church, there is also a way that this can be done in a way that is harmful, that is not conducive to actually building capacity and making a difference. Just the fact that you're connecting with the church does not necessarily say, well, you are answering and addressing or bringing a solution. And that's why we want to be very careful as to listen to what the church in those communities are facing and are needing. And many times the well-resourced church can come with their ready-made solutions that do not apply, that do not bring results. So we have to be careful not to overwhelm by our very presence. That's a word of caution as well.
And I think that one of the things, are we going to take, do we have time for a couple questions?
Maybe one or
Okay,
two.
while they get you guys settled, one of the things I'm loving hearing from this panel is that these are solutions that are happening in country. These are communities and churches beginning the work of healing internally. They don't, y'all aren't, nobody's, please help us, U.S., we can't do this on our own. Y'all are talking about a great capacity for healing. All right.
Well, just to follow up on what Edward said, that pastor trip that I went on resulted in my wife and I sponsoring a 6-year-old boy who's now 12. And that in itself would have been awesome, to think that one child is connected to a church. That would be awesome. But it also planted the seed for our church to have a partnership with the church in El Salvador. And we helped start the Child Development Center for about $25,000. And within 30 minutes, all the child sponsorships were taken up by members of our congregation, and we had to open up more. We have about 250 kids that we're sponsoring in El Salvador. So I say the awesome thing about that is that every sponsor gets all the information with the letters. So it's a way of changing the whole culture of your church to think about what's actually happening in these Central American countries, and I'm actually investing in one child connected to a church, and I think that really makes mission very, very personal and transformation very personal for our members. So it's not a question, just wanted to affirm that.
Mike, maybe one more question. I think there was a question over here. Sorry.
Thank you, and thank you for a great evening, not just with this, but all of the presentations. If I may, this is not a question about this, but since it's the end of the night, I have a question really for you, Scott, I guess. We were presented earlier today, or this evening, with two options relating to legislation, one of them being an idea that the congressman has that he would like to see go forward if there's enough support for it. The other is a letter that we were asked to sign that is in favor of the concept of something like that. My question is, would the congressman appreciate our signing that letter? And if a lot of us get support for that letter, does that help him in making his concept reality? And if that is the case, other than 50 of us going back to facing the tyranny of the urgent, where we totally forget what we were going to do when we left here, is there some plan to pursue that in such a way that we follow through as an organization to see to it that the groundswell, which he requested, bottom-up support to make this a real movement such that it might happen?
I'm looking to see if I have a $10 bill that I can give you for that question. Thank you for that question. And first of all, let me say thank you to this panel for taking us into the countries where you are serving. It was really helpful for all of us to get a bit of an insight there, and thank you for leading us, Bekah. So let's thank our panel.